Hey, what's up guys? Will here for GSM Arena. This is the Moto G9 Power. It's a mid-ranger, and as the name might suggest, it prioritizes battery life above everything else. But just how great is the battery life here, and are the trade-offs worth it? Let's find out in our full review. The Moto G9 Power is a mid-range device built from plastic. The fingerprint-style texture on its matte back is quite interesting. The texture is rough and adds some extra grip. You get a water-repellent coating protecting the internals too, like on other Moto phones. However, the G9 Power is very different from last year's G8 Power. In fact, looking at the spec sheet, you might call it somewhat of a downgrade. Rather than a 1080p display, now there's a 720p resolution. You don't have stereo speakers this time around. And instead of a versatile quad camera setup, including an ultra-wide and telephoto, you just get a secondary macro cam and a depth sensor. Even the build materials are different. This is all plastic, while the G8 Power had an aluminum frame. So why would you go for this one instead? Well, the G Power phones are built for battery life, and in that regard, this year's model is a clear improvement. The G9 Power has a larger 6000 mAh battery, and with it was able to score an amazing 155 hours in our battery life tests, one of the best endurance ratings we've seen to date. You'll be able to use the phone for a really long time without needing to charge, but when you do, you can use the included 20-watt turbocharge adapter. With such a large battery, we didn't expect great charging speeds, but the G9 Powers was actually slower than what we imagined. We were able to go from 0 to only 20% charge in the first half an hour. The improvement in battery life this year appears to be not only thanks to the larger battery, but also the lower res LCD screen. At 6.8 inches, it's actually gotten larger, but the resolution has been bumped down to 720p. It has a standard refresh rate and a punch hole for the selfie cam. We did notice some uneven backlighting around this hole, which is actually pretty common on LCDs, and most noticeable with a white background. And of course, since you have a low resolution on a larger screen, you have a pretty low pixel density of 263 ppi. This lends a bit of a grainy look to your interface and content. At least the contrast and black levels are pretty decent here, and you can actually achieve pretty accurate colors if you switch color modes and settings. The screen's brightness is about average for an LCD, around 430 nits maximum with the slider and 520 nits in auto mode in bright conditions. But the minimum brightness is commendable at just 3 nits. For audio, the Moto G9 Power has a traditional 3.5mm jack, great for plugging in your traditional headphones, especially since there's FM radio on board. But as I mentioned earlier, you only get a single bottom firing speaker here, rather than the loud stereo speakers of last year's model. This speaker earned an average score in our loudness test, and quality is alright, with decent mids, but highs are lacking. The other feature that's a downgrade from last year is the camera setup. However, while the G8 Power's cameras were very versatile, we weren't impressed with the actual quality there, so let's see what the G9 Power can do. The G9 Power has 3 cameras on the back, a 64-megapixel quad-bare main cam, a 2-megapixel macro camera, and a depth sensor. 16-megapixel photos from the main camera turned out a lot better than we expected. They're excellent for this class, with rich detail, true-to-life colors, acceptable noise levels, and wide dynamic range. It's a clear upgrade over the quality of last year's main cam. You could argue that it's better to have one good camera than a bunch of mediocre ones. The 2-megapixel depth sensor should lend a hand to the main cam in portrait mode. These are great, with abundant detail, nice contrast, and decent subject separation. Close-up shots taken with the 2-megapixel macro camera are okay. You get enough detail, but the contrast and colors leave more to be desired. And even though there is autofocus, the photos don't always come out sharp. Low-light photos from the main cam aren't very good. They're underexposed, poor in detail, and quite noisy. The colors are washed out too. Using night vision mode does improve the exposure and the color dramatically. It also gets rid of noise, but you end up with less detail. For selfies, the G9 Power has a 16-megapixel quad-bare front-facing cam, and photos come out in 4 megapixels by default. They have good detail and excellent colors and contrast, but limited dynamic range. Unlike the Moto G8 Power, the G9 can't shoot 4K video. 1080p videos captured by the main cam are average in detail, but with good colors, contrast, and dynamic range, and well-handled noise. There is electronic stabilization too. Now let's go over some of the G9 Power's other features. Although more and more phones are updating to the new Android 11, Motorola phones are still bringing a near-stock version of Android 10, with some Moto functions sprinkled in here and there. Pretty much everything is handled by Google's apps, including multimedia, except for Motorola's radio app. You can check out pretty much all of Moto's proprietary features through the handy Moto interface. These include customization options for your layouts and icons. Another feature worth mentioning here is Peak Display. It's not an always-on display, but it allows you to light up a similar sort of interface when you pick up the phone. You get the time and notifications which you can interact with without having to unlock. Unlocking the phone is done with a rear-mounted fingerprint scanner, which is plenty fast and accurate. And for storage, you get 128 gigs on board the Moto G9 Power, and it is expandable via microSD. Under the hood of the G9 Power is a Snapdragon 662 chipset, which is built on an 11nm process. It's quite similar to the Snapdragon 665 inside of last year's model. In benchmarks, CPU performance isn't terrible, but the G9 Power falls behind other phones in this price range. It's also not very impressive GPU-wise. However, thanks to its low-res display, it's actually able to perform better than last year's model in benchmarks, as well as gaming. You can get some acceptable gameplay if you dial down graphics settings. Still, when browsing the interface, things do feel a bit sluggish from time to time. So that's the Moto G9 Power. You get a comfortable build with a grippy finish, a large LCD screen, a capable main camera, and some of the best battery life in the business. However, there are a few shortcomings here. Mediocre chipset performance is somewhat expected at this price, but it's worth mentioning. Plus, the low screen resolution and the single speaker instead of stereo speakers aren't very welcome changes from last year's model. And while we like the improved main camera, we miss having a more versatile setup. So overall, in this price range, the Moto G9 Power is a decent phone if incredible battery life is what you're really looking for. But as far as the rest of the features go, there are competitors that can offer more. We won't be recommending this one, at least until its price goes down a little. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and see you on the next one.